Octavia Butler is one of the high lords of modern science fiction, and I think it's natural to wonder which author may inherit her legacy. So, this is the question that I'd like to explore, and I think that I already have an author in mind. Just kidding, I definitely have an author in mind. So, I'd like to explain why these two authors' connection is so important, and also perhaps the mistakes that some readers make when linking these two authors together. I'm not going to go into the identity of the second author just yet, but we already know who the first author is. It's Octavia Butler. Butler's written so many books that belong to the high literary pantheon. For readers, their first literary awakening may have been with the time-traveling Kindred. It's a book that tells us how slavery's painful history persists still, and it impacts our national culture to this day. And I won't give anything away, but no one who's read that ending can forget it. I don't know about you, but I still think about that ending to this day. Among her many memorable works, her most commonly cited text, however, is Parable of the Sower. This is one of two books we'll discuss for this video today. We'll explore what it says and what it does for readers. More importantly, we'll see how it establishes an important legacy for other authors to follow. It's this narrative inheritance that'll be the focus for this question: who comes next? So when we discuss our second author, we'll look at the important thematic conversations she picks up from Butler. But first, let's return to Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. A journey into the literary criticism on the book reveals that this is the most written and talked about book of hers by far. It's second only to Kindred, and I'd say Lilith's Brood trilogy is probably a distant third, although it's up there too. I went over a summary of Parable of the Sower in another video. It was a couple of videos ago, in fact. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that right now, but I'd like to provide at least some context before we move forward. And we're going to look at the novel before our reading of the book. Lauren, she's the young main character of this book, and she lives in a small multiracial community with her family outside of a near future Los Angeles. Her family includes a father who's a pastor, a stepmother, and also brothers. Immediately, we get a hint of danger that's going on in this community, or rather outside this community. Her community has these large walls posted, and they also have guards that protect them from a myriad of outer menaces. Although many perils lurk, the most severe are the addicts of a new drug called pyro. They are compelled by delusion to ignite fires and raid communities who are perceived to be vulnerable to attack. This future California hasn't devolved from a specific disaster, or really, for that matter, a social fissure. Rather, it's slowly worsened from long-term divestment in public goods. And I'm talking about things like public education, sanitation, transportation, policing, safety net programs, environmental protections, and other social institutions. These are actually some of the specific things mentioned. This is a world that feels uncomfortably like a warning written 30 years too early. The second characteristic of this world is really the dominance of protectionism and profit. Many people have traded their enclaves, their neighborhoods, and really even their individual freedom for the more secure corporate communities that promise security in exchange for very low-paid work and indentured servitude. The last vestige of hope for any national American cohesion is an idealistic but waning national space program that fascinates Lauren. But it has dwindling public support, and really, Lauren is among a few remaining supporters of the program. No, there isn't space travel in this book because this book is far and away about survival. But in Lauren's conception of this new religion called Earthseed, she imagines a long, long, far away future when humans will colonize the stars. However, this is significantly unrealistic, given especially where her world finds itself now. The main characters eventually shift from stability to migrancy. And as a group of wanderers, they seem to lose their sense of civic and public cohesion. It's actually Lauren's new religion that seems not only to be an alternative to her father's religion, but it develops into an implicit strategy to reestablish lost community, place, and land. It's unclear whether this is possible, again, given the state of the world, or if this is just another idealistic vision, which it very well may be. Much like the aforementioned space travel, peace in this world, right now in the book, may be a pie in the sky proposition. Through the goals of Earthseed, Butler begins to show readers a way through the apocalypse, and it involves really retying bonds with other folks. Scholar Marlene Allen describes the book like this. Thus, she teaches us, as readers, both important lessons about history as well as techniques we might use to survive through the impending environmental, societal, and economic crises that are destined to evolve as a result of our current actions, or rather, inactions. The fact that Lauren and others' quest for settlement speaks directly to their core desires. This perhaps is Butler's own parable for readers. Community is the antidote. You may have heard past explanations of this book on YouTube, or for that matter, on this channel. Maybe you discussed this book in a class. It's pretty popular in classes. Did you know some people have reported feeling underwhelmed by this book or something like that? I think much of it comes from its hype. Readers are often told, as I was, that this is not only a great piece of science fiction, but it's also an important work of literary fiction. Admittedly, I went into this book with that expectation. And again, admittedly, I had a similar letdown. However, don't hit me with your anger yet. As I discussed Parable with other readers, I heard about big ideas that I missed. And as the list of significant themes flourished with each new conversation, especially with Julie, my wife, I actually learned Parable of the Sower is largely about what we miss in the world, and certainly in the book. Now, stay with me here. The novel's loudest parts are its violence and extremes. Movement just keeps going. Lauren and others never really break even, but they avoid most of the time losing everything, including their lives. And that is mostly just enough. Their fight is constant. Their community battles pyros and raiders. Lauren and her father struggled to keep the family together and really alive. And of course, the migrants endeavor to keep the basics. For goodness sake, Lauren's most significant repeated phrase is, I mean to survive. That's bleak. And really, that's all there seems to be with this book. Butler heightens the will to survive by keeping her characters in constant motion and instability. This is why Lauren's religion, Earthseed, adopts adaptability and moldability as major tenets. She lives in a world in which crisis is the only constant. So it's natural for her philosophy for living, understandably, to absorb this temperament as a main cornerstone. Because so much happens in this story, it's understandable to perceive this constant movement as perhaps muting or flattening of the narrative. That is, violence is so continuous in this book that really, as a result, nothing seems to happen. It's like white noise with the volume turned up. If everything is loud, nothing is particularly noticeable. But even if the survival plot is cacophonous, it doesn't mean that nothing else happens. In fact, the survival motif's volume factors into the book's significance. Let's look at a list of all the events that happen. And you'll see a lot happens in the book, but the relative volume of the background is actually easy to miss. These details read like ambient noise. But listen to these descriptions. And don't worry, I'm not going to give much away. The federal government progressively collapses throughout Lauren's young years and really into her older years as well. Private companies expand their power and protection to fill the void of a lapsed government. The environment around the community becomes unsafe. Fires are a regular occurrence, and the reason the drug pyro is so dangerous is that it is so dry. And hot extremes of Southern California mean that any fires rage out of control. Water is also a factor, and the community not only does not have the capacity to extinguish fires, but water is such a big commodity that has become the center of economic trade, practically money. Slavery has returned to this world, and it hits everyone regardless of race or social condition. The main characters never experience this directly except for a few characters later on, so the subject mostly keeps to the background. Finally, anti black racism is back with a vengeance. And alarmingly, for example, readers learn that mixing races can be a death sentence. And, quote, that can be dangerous these days. On the street, people are expected to fear and hate everyone but their own kind. People stared at us, but they mostly left us alone because of our guns. The anti black racism peaks at other points in the book, and it keeps coming back as an ambient threat to the larger and then eventually the smaller community. The truth is that the book is actually about all of these things: the environment, class, racism. But these topics are mostly subsumed under the louder noise of violence and also the will to survive. And understandably, readers' initial reactions may actually omit their significance because of this narrative dynamic. Noise, loudness, crisis, and pain drowns out the substance, community, and understanding. In the end, which, don't worry, I won't reveal, we learn that the most significant things in the novel are the ones we miss. The structural inequalities that result in oppression and ferocity are causes of a forced hypervigilance, which makes many readers miss everything that builds to the ending and also the ending's implication. This is actually what happens when humans are pushed into shock again and again. The important things become side notes. Economic inequality, racism, violence, and a shocking rise of modern slavery are the underlying causes of everything. And Lauren frequently, but unfortunately momentarily, realizes this. Several times she tells everyone, quote, survival is not enough. So paradoxically, living to survive is not sufficient to living in this world. And Lauren recognizes that actually survival requires the human cohesion and connections they ignore during these crises. Butler's novel ultimately shows the structural conditions of modern economic repression that feed crises. It's the structural view of oppression and social hierarchy where our other author enters the conversation. We'll look at this other author's work and its inheritance from Butler in just a short moment. If I had to levy one criticism of Butler's novel, it's that her complex treatment of structural racism sometimes gets lost in the binaries of exploitative politics. As stated by scholar Marlene Allen, Butler critiques the social science of economics by highlighting 20th century capitalism's dehumanization of the vulnerable, just as antebellum slavery exploited African Americans. Thus, Butler seems to characterize exploitation as a two-tier antagonism between oppressed and oppressor, or to use the philosophical term, master and slave. Our next novelist builds on Butler's ideas by digging a bit more into this literary conversation, and she further complicates the politics of exploitation. To put this another way, she yes ands the conversation about systemic hierarchies and racism by specifically challenging this master slave narrative. And she introduces additional problems like colonialism to complicate the constellation of dynamics that actually feed anti Blackness. Quick note, in philosophy, this idea of master and slave usually refers to two related but distinct ideas: Hegel's master slave dialectic and Nietzsche's master slave morality. Both of the philosophers use slavery as a metaphor for relations of power and dependence, not as literal endorsements of slavery. Master is a metaphor for the dominant, slave is a metaphor for submission. This idea was later discussed in post colonial philosophies, and it took on a newer, you might say, realer meaning when discussed in terms of race, history, and colonialism. This opens up a whole new critique of Western philosophy, but that's another story that we probably will not get into later. Now, here's where I want to make an argument and address what I think is a common mistake readers make when they put Butler and N.K. Jemisin side by side. The mistake is comparison by similarity. People say that Jemisin is the next Butler because both write Black women protagonists into speculative futures. Both engage with catastrophe and survival, and both won major awards. And while none of that is wrong, it does actually flatten what's happening in both of these books. Jemison isn't just writing like Butler, she's writing in conversation with Butler, picking up specific thematic threads, pulling them further, and sometimes pulling them where Butler never went. That's not the next Butler, that's a literary dialogue across time. And it's one of the reasons these two books, read together, are so much more powerful than either one alone. N.K. Jemison's novel, The Fifth Season, is our next topic. Her framing of oppression advances Butler's conversation on systemic social hierarchies by introducing several new factors that Butler didn't. The ideas that I'm about to reference were originally observed by a scholar named Jasmine Wade in her really wonderful article that I cite in the video description if you'd like to take a look. Before we get into questions about Jemison's inheritance from Butler, let's ground the discussion in a quick summary. I went over this book in another video, so I'll try not to copy what I did there. Although in that video, I hadn't read this book yet, so this is perhaps a little deeper. The fifth season is Jemison's first book in the sci fi Broken Earth trilogy. In this story, she divides the plot into three different narrative cycles, and these cycles are spread over the course of the entire novel. The first narrative is about a little girl named Demaya, who's taken from her family by someone named a guardian. She's to be trained at a special place called the Fulcrum because of her dangerous inherited powers. The Maya is someone called an orogene who can control Earth and its energies. Think Earth sorcerers, but more actually tonally science fiction than fantasy. And don't worry, I will probably mispronounce orogene many times, mainly because it's a made up word. For most of their recorded history, the orogenes are trained as the Empire's slaves. Their job is to quell frequent earthquakes on this continent. But according to a disciplinary class called Guardians, orogenes' powers can grow gravely out of control. So, Guardians are the world's supposed protectors who regulate their orogene charges through psychological manipulation and violence. I'll leave it up to you on whether or not that sounds protective. The second continuous narrative takes us through a story of a more mature orogene. Her name is Cyanite. She's still early in her career, but she's allowed to take contracts on behalf of the Empire's Fulcrum. In the beginning of her narrative, she's directed to use her powers to resolve a client's problem, which is to clear blockage from a community's harbor. She's accompanied by her mentor, Alabaster, with whom she's also compelled to breed. This is one of the many details that bear a direct parallel to historical slavery in America. Enslaved peoples were bred together in order to grow the enslaved population at low cost. Historically, the slave trade was outlawed in America in 1808, but slavery continued, and breeding was permitted until the end of the Civil War 60 years later. These practices were designed to perpetuate a population in enslavement. Through this detail and others, Cyanite's story reveals deeper agonies about the orogenes' lives. The third concurrent narrative is written in second person about a woman named Asun. Her husband has killed her son and kidnapped their daughter. So when we meet her, Asun is in the process of tracking them over months and miles. Along the way, she meets an older woman and a young boy named Hoa, who travel with her and help her along the way. Asun is a little older than Cyanite. We also learn in this third narrative about the ongoing threat of something called a season that wreaks havoc on the continent and its people. All three of these narratives are connected for the span of the entire novel, but the exact connections are only revealed over time. The stillness is a continent where unknown lengths of time and relative peace have been interrupted by events of globe rattling cataclysms called seasons. In fact, the back of the book has an index of known seasons of the past and also their stories. But suffice it to say that these are civilization ending crises. Thus, the empire in this novel must constantly renew itself after each season ends. The one thing that keeps the historical timeline together is something called the stonelore, which is really a series of the empire's sayings and histories that persist through each season. But it becomes clear that the proclamations in this written history build an intentional social hierarchy, and they keep the various classes in place and the orogenes in particular in subjugation. Broadly speaking, the orogenes parallel enslavement. So, in addition to being an existing science fiction narrative, this book can be read allegorically about the structures that maintain this system and also systemic racism. Remember, Butler's parable frames systemic racism through a binary, which is the oppressor oppressed or master slave idea that we discussed earlier. Some critics have said at times that this makes her characters feel flat. Again, this is them, not me. Send hate mail there, not here. On the other hand, Jemisin's The Fifth Season shows that systemic racism is less binary and more intertwined. That is, her origins are part of a social system of interlocking and overlapping dependencies. So, as Jemison's book unfolds, readers gain insight into this mysterious hierarchy that resembles less a master slave narrative and more of a colonial power dynamic. Again, I will cite Jasmine Wade's article on the usage of colonial here and in this reading. For Wade, it simply means that the system of oppression includes additional competitions more than just two factors. Chief among the additional forms of competition in this world and in colonialism is a struggle over land. That is, who owns it, who calls it home, or who exploits it. Since new variables are added to the dynamic, origins don't just have to worry about one threat, they have to worry about several. But so do others in this hierarchy. And the goal isn't just power. In this world, it's also resources. These additional systemic threats include, but are not limited to, land exploitation, class rivalries, and also socialized subordination. As learned in Demaya's narrative, the origins are incredibly powerful and useful. But because of this power, the Empire deems them dangerous, and they seek to control and discipline them into subservience. Admittedly, as I read this book, I wondered why this hugely powerful race didn't just take over and overthrow their masters. But the novel addresses this through a number of techniques, most notably something again called the stone lore. Stone lore is a sort of history and religious text all in one. But really, it's instructions to clarify everyone's role, their relationship with the land, and the weight of the empire's problems they bear. As readers, we're provided with these neat little maxims at the end of each chapter, but they're pretty dark. The quasi religious social norms written into stone lore systematically codify a social strata or levels, particularly through a history that clarifies origins as bad and needing to discipline, and land as a rival to be exploited. For example, the so called guardian class is meant to take origins from their families when they're young. Young origins are pliable and vulnerable to emotional manipulation and socialization, which is why they're early victims. If the origins are too old, the stone lore notes that they are unredeemable and they should be eliminated, but killed is what it means. So the lesson is don't be an old, untamed origin. To really rub salt in the wound, the Empire also has a slur for the origins. They call them raga, but this term is particularly reserved for origins who are unredeemable. It's impolite to call a tame origin by this name, but as with slurs, it happens a lot. These are just two of the obvious subordination techniques used against origins. The slurs and the get them while they're young schemes create part of a cultural tapestry that trains the origin mind for subordination. So, why don't the origins rebel? It's their own psychology. It's ingrained in them early on. They are indoctrinated early on to enslave themselves. It reminds me a little bit of Malcolm X's description of a slave mentality. He frequently described the psychological consequence of white supremacy as resulting in self hatred and submission. For this channel's longer term viewers, several people a while ago recommended Carter G. Woodson, and his most famous book is The Miseducation. The following quote echoes the dynamic Jemisin actually describes in her origins, and it answers our question about rebellion. Why don't they rebel? Carter G. Woodson says, when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. You don't have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his benefit. His education makes it necessary. Early in Damaya's narrative, readers see the beginning of her education, and more to the point, her manipulation. Her own guardian seemingly rescues her from an abusive family situation. When he sees the condition in which she's been living, he chastises the family, as someone from Child Protective Services might do. And he's a savior, right? However, as he takes her to the fulcrum, he confusingly and lovingly breaks her hand. She soon associates pain and subordination with love and protection. The lesson follows her into her formative years. It ensures Damaya's complicity in her own subservience. Simultaneously, it imprints the moment with affection and therefore conditions her for willing participation in the very systems and institutions that cause her pain. This comes up throughout the book again and again. This telling event makes Origins paradoxically masters of the land and enslaved to its people. The lessons don't end there. The stonelore turns to Origene's power against them by stigmatizing both it and the earth itself. Through mines, etc., the empire establishes that the earth is to be exploited and used. This rivalry severs the Origines from the source of their great power, the land and the earth. The stone lore is filled with stories about humans' contentiousness with the earth. A common curse, for example, are the words evil earth, which in our own world might be comparable to the F bomb or maybe the SH word. And be careful because of YouTube. Professor of Ethnic Studies Jasmine Wade notes that the novel's empire writes the logic of colonialism onto the land. The earth, says the history, is a rival to peace and prosperity. And I paraphrase here, it is written that Father Earth burned with hatred because the people turned on him. Thus, the imperial record reinforces an antagonism that justifies two principles. Value must be extracted from the land, and orogenes must serve this purpose. As the novel unfolds, the more detail we learn about the stillness and stonelore, the more we learn, like the main characters, that the learned mythology is bunk. That myths like the master slave binaries are part of the empire's lie. In actuality, says Jemisin's novel, this is a world based on the force dynamics and rivalries that permit massive, universal exploitation and justify privilege for a few and domination for most. So, who comes next after Octavia Butler? I think the answer is less about succession and really more about conversation. Jemisin doesn't step into Butler's place, she steps into dialogue with her. She takes the questions Butler raised about community, identity, and power and asks them again harder in a world that looks different on the surface but carries the same wounds underneath. Read collectively, these two novels think together. They ask you to consider who gets to survive, who gets to belong, and whose story gets told. That's why I keep coming back to Black speculative fiction. Because it predicts the future, and because it takes seriously the idea that the future is something we make, and that making it requires honestly confronting what we're carrying from the past. If you haven't read these two books, I hope this video has given you a reason to start. And if you have, I'd love to know in the comments which one stayed with you longer and why. This is Tilting at Tomes. I'm Ben. As always, thank you for watching and keep reading.